broader is psychopathic here? Are we defining?
Well, I can define it. I mean,
sure, yeah, go for it.
Well, a psychopath will gain short-term advantage at the cost of long-term relationship.
Okay.
That's really the core issue. Well, you know, you made a reference to something like that earlier in your discussion when you pointed out that people claim to be motivated, let's say, by principle, but will default to short-term gratification more or less at the drop of a hat. Yeah, exactly. Well, the exaggerated proclivity to do that is at the essence of psychopathy. So it's very immature.
I'm curious, with this definition of psychopathy, does that mean
the definition of psychopathy. It's not it's not mine. That's the core of psychopathy.
Okay, I'm not in the United States. I think we call it all ASPD now.
No, it's separate from that's antisocial personality disorder.
I thought that subsumed psychopathy and sociopathy.
Psychopathy is more like it's more the pathological core of antisocial personality disorder.
Okay, maybe that might be true. Okay,
that's a better way of thinking. Like the worst. A small number of criminals are responsible for the vast majority of crimes. It's 1% commit 65%, something like that.
Do you think, is psychopathy something that can be environmentally induced, or do you think this is core to a person?
It's both. Okay. So, for example, if you're disagreeable, like you are, by the way, your proclivity, if you went wrong, would be to go wrong in an antisocial and psychopathic direction. And that's more true of men, for example, than it is for women. That's why men are more likely to be in prison by a lot. I think it's 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 generally. It depends on the particular crime, with it being higher proportion of men as the violence of the crime mounts. So you can imagine on the genetic versus environment side. So imagine that when you're delivered your temperamental hand of cards, you're going to have a certain set of advantages that go along with them that are part and parcel of that genetic determination. And there's going to be a certain set of temptations as well. So, for example, if you're high in trait neuroticism, you're going to be quite sensitive to the suffering of others and be able to detect that. That's useful for infant care. But the cost you'll pay is that you'll be more likely to develop depression and anxiety. And if you're disagreeable, extroverted, and unconscientious, then the place you'll go if you go badly is in the psychopathic or antisocial direction. And there are environmental determinants of that to some degree.
Sure, genes express themselves in an environment. I agree. When I'm just curious for the definition of psychopathy, for short-term gain at the expense of long-term
relationship. Really, that's probably the best bit. Yeah.
When you look at stuff like people that are self-destructive, say people that engage in behavior like obesity, is that like a type of psychopathy to you, or is that like something different, or how do you define these types of things, I guess, or how do you view that type of thing?
Well, no, there is an overlap in that addictive processes, one of which might lead to obesity, do have this problem of prioritization of the short term. But so that overlaps with the short-term orientation of the psychopath. But a psychopath an obese person isn't gaining anything from your demise to facilitate their obesity, right? So there's a predatory and parasitical element to psychopathy that's not there in other addictive short-term processes.
Do you think, is it possible that there are things, because then to circle back to the tribal example I gave, isn't it possible that people can commit harms against other people where they're not necessarily gaining from their demise, but it's just some other sort of gain that they're doing better? So for instance, like I'm talking to some friends and I'm just gossiping or shit-talking another person. I'm not necessarily feeling good that I'm trashing them per se. I'm feeling good because this group of friends might view me more favorably because I have like a gossip or something to share with them.
Well, but that's the gain right there. And you are contributing to the demise of the people that you're gossiping about.
But I think I feel like there's fundamentally different type of thought process between like, I want to tell you something juicy about this guy because it'll make you like me, versus I want to tell you something juicy about this guy because I hate this guy and I want him to like have a worse reputation among people. I feel like there's different drivers for that.
I would say that's an interesting distinction. I would say probably that the hatred-induced malevolence is a worse form of malevolence than the popularity-inducing malevolence.
Yeah, the only reason
it's a tough one, but
yeah, the only reason I bring that up is because I feel like a lot of malevolence that we have social guardrails for is that type of like selfish malevolence where you're not. I would argue even the majority of malevolence in the world is usually people acting selfishly or being inconsiderate, not necessarily like I hate this.
Yeah,
person,
I think that's right. Sure, I think that's why Dante outlined levels of hell. Right. Yeah, well, exactly that. And I mean, that book was an investigation into the structure of malevolence, right? He put betrayal at the bottom, which I think is right. I think that's right, because people who develop post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, which almost only accompanies an encounter with malevolence rather than tragic circumstances, they are often betrayed, sometimes by other people, but often by themselves. And yes, there are levels of hell, you know, and you outlined a couple there.
So I guess then my question is just that if you have people, so the kid that steals an orange from a stand, not because he hates the shop owner, but because he wants the orange or he's hungry, without some type of societal, it doesn't have to be the government, it could be family, religious, without some type of use of force, do you think that society ever exists without
use force on your wife?
Well, what are we considering force? Is withholding sex, for instance, is that considered force? Or is, you know, saying we're going to cancel a vacation?
Deprivation of an expected reward is a punishment. So you could, well, no, but I mean, this is a serious question. I mean, look, if we're thinking about the optimization of social structures, we might as well start from the base level of social structure and scaffold up.
Sure. So I was like, if a wife is upset at a husband, for instance, would that be considered use of force? I think a negative punishment. You're removing a stimulus to punish a person for something. Yeah, would you consider that like a use of force? Or
I would say it would depend to some degree on the intent.
The intent is to punish a behavior,
well, if the intent is to punish, then it's starting to move into the domain of force. I mean, look, while we've been talking, you know, there's been bursts of emotion, right?
Yeah.
And that's because we're freeing entropy and trying to close and to enclose it again. And so that's going to produces negative emotion fundamentally, most fundamentally anxiety and pain, and secondarily something like anger, because those emotions are quite tightly linked.
Sure.
And so within the confines of a marriage, because we might as well make it concrete, there are going to be times when disagreements result in bursts of emotion. And those bursts of emotion don't necessarily have to have an instrumental quality, right? It's when the emotion is used manipulatively to gain an advantage that's short-term for the person. And then maybe that's at the expense of the other person, or even at the expense of the person who benefits future self. Then it starts to tilt into the manipulative. There's a tetrad of traits. So narcissism, Machiavellianism, that's manipulativeness. Narcissism is the desire for unearned social status. That's what you'd gain, for example, if you were gossiping and elevating your social status.